Hello folks, and welcome to the channel, or welcome back. And in this video we're going to adjust the Weber carburetor for its main and acceleration circuit. And I know this video has been wanted for a long time, so now is the time to get it done. We will have to take it either to the track or on a fast road or somewhere else, or a dyno, because you can't do this really statically. So you have to drive the car in the way you intend to drive the car. So in other words, we are adjusting the main circuit for purpose and for use. But what does it really mean, fit for purpose and fit for use? And what that really means is, if you have a daily car with a Weber carburetor that you drive in the normal traffic, then most likely your engine is kind of geared, tuned towards a power or torque range in the lower to mid RPMs. That's where you want to tune the carburetor on your main circuit. On the other hand, if you have a fast road car, then most likely you're driving this car on rallies and things like that. And then most likely you're going to always try to drive in the mid-range of your RPMs, because this is for what the engine is built. This is the kind of camshaft that you have in the car. So this is where you want to tune the engine on. On the other hand, if you're having a race car, which is getting on the track, for instance, or a speedway or whatever, then it's a bit of a different story. Then you're going to drive in the high RPM range because you're going to have a 300 degrees camshaft or even a larger camshaft, which is actually going to move the power band into the upper RPMs, or the mid and upper RPMs, or high RPMs. So we're going to tune it on that. So that is important to know before you start tuning. But the process and procedure that I'm going to explain you is exactly the same. It is just the way you're going to drive it when you're going to sense the car, when you are going to observe the car, what it does on that specific condition. That's the only difference. And in this video, I'm going to tune the Weber carburetor, which is a DCOE 45 on my MGB GT. And this is a race car. I'm having a 720 SP camshaft in it. It's a 300 degrees camshaft, so racing purposes. The power band is between 4,500 and 7,000. So that is why I'm going to drive this car on the track at this high RPM rate. That's where my power band is, because I want to keep my RPMs there during a race, because that's where I have the power. I'm just going to shift up and down to stay in that range. But for tuning purposes, I'm going to take the car on the track and then test it out there on that RPM range. And I'll explain you on how we're going to do this. If you have a different car for a different purpose, it doesn't really matter. You drive for your specific purpose and use on your car, and then you tune the carburetor with the same methodology, the same approach. So here is the carburetor on the MG, which we're going to tune. This is a DCOE 45, and it's fitted to a stage 3 cylinder head on the MGB GT engine. The engine has been enlarged to a 1950. We have a camshaft in it, as I mentioned before, which is a 720 SP. We have a modified crankshaft as well. There's a modified flywheel, a racing clutch, and also we have installed a fuel system that delivers the proper volume and the proper pressure. So I have a pressure regulator that regulates the pressure into the carburetor. Now the carburetor itself has been baselined. If you like to know on how to baseline your carburetor for your specific engine, then I recommend that you look on one of my videos where I explain everything about baselining your carburetor. So the point is, you need to start with a good baseline on your carburetor for your engine before we start actually tuning that main circuit and the acceleration. Of course, a proper baseline is mandatory to start tuning the carburetor. However, there are a couple of other prerequisites that we have to meet before you start tuning, because otherwise it really doesn't make a lot of sense to start tuning. So first of all, you've got to make sure that your engine is in a good condition. That means that you have to have proper compression on all cylinders and equal between all cylinders, or almost equal. The second point is that you have to make sure that your camshaft is properly dialed in, that you have the correct advance on your ignition, that you have the correct fuel pressure and the correct fuel volume to be delivered by the fuel pump, so you don't run low on the fuel chamber in the carburetor when you're revving it up way high up, so when the car starts to consume a lot of fuel. So these are all things you have to make sure that they are in place. And of course you have to have the right fuel, the fuel you're going to race with. Don't use it with different fuels. If you're going to tune it with a fuel which is different than the fuel you're going to race with, then that is not a good idea. Once we are with this car on the track, there isn't going to be a lot of time to explain a lot of other technical aspects on how to adjust. So I'm going to do it up front. But for the main circuit, we only go in to adjust the air correction jet and the main fuel jet that you find on the emulsion tube. So all you need to do on the track, once you've done your test ride, is take this cover off, is to remove the emulsion tube, to change the air correction jet and the main fuel jet. And you have two of them, one for each of the barrels of the carburetor. Now, I have cold hands, so this might be a little bit difficult to get it out. There we go. So here we have the emulsion tube, and I'll give you a little bit of a close-up in a second. Here we have the emulsion tube. I pulled off the top part. You just need to pull that off. Underneath you will find the air correction jet, which is in my case is 160, and I have my main fuel jet, which is 140. The emulsion tube itself is an F16. You can get also different emulsion tubes, and the difference is the size and the openings and the holes that you have in it. But an F16 just fits fine. An F11 will work fine as well for me. Now, how to start off with these different jets is something you need to do in the baselining of your carburetor. As I said before, there is a video on my channel that explains all that. But once we are on the track and we did our test ride, we go into, if necessary, either enlarge or decrease the main fuel jet, or we do it on the air correction jet, enlarge or reduce. It depends on what we have experienced on the track. So I'm not going to change the jets yet. That's going to be for the next run. I'm just going to try one more time because I did have no backfire. So if you go into the track to adjust all this, we will need a set of jets. So we will need air correction jets for the main circuit. We'll need also then the main jets, fuel jets for the main circuit, and we also might need some acceleration jets and acceleration pump valve jets in case you have that fitted to your carburetor. So that is important. This stuff is not all that expensive. I think it runs you €2 about, or €1.50 per jet, of course, not per two, but per jet. And you always need 2 per carburetor. If you have 2 carburetors on your car, you're going to need 4, so keep that in mind. But take that with you and keep it labeled, because otherwise it's going to become a big mess. So here's a little recap on how the main circuit on a Weber carburetor is working, just in case you have forgotten. So we have an emulsion tube, and on the top of that we have an air correction jet, and on the bottom we have a main fuel jet. The emulsion tube is of a certain type. In my case it's an F16, and then the main fuel jet is on the bottom, which is actually submerged in the fuel chamber of your carburetor. So the fuel chamber is sitting here, and it's surrounded with fuel. Now the little holes on the side of the emulsion tube, they are leading into a channel which are going to the auxiliary venturi, where the airflow is actually coming through, the air being sucked in by the engine. And we will have a venturi effect right here. In other words, the airflow comes over this opening and it creates a depression, and this is how it's going to suck out the emulsion. So we'll have fuel coming in through the bottom, we have air coming in through the top. All that will mix up in an emulsion, and an emulsion is a mixture of air bubbles and fuel bubbles, and that emulsion is then sucked out by the venturi effect, the depression that we have here, into the barrel of the carburetor, and then of course it gets vaporized by the airflow. So this is how that main circuit works, and we can influence that mixture here, this emulsion, on how many air bubbles and how many fuel bubbles we have, depending on the size of the main jet and depending on the size of the air correction jet. And this is what we're going to adjust and tune during this video. Here is the process that I go through for adjusting a Weber carburetor. And I'm not saying you have to do the same thing, but this has always worked for me. So in the first place, I'm going to note down what my starting conditions are of my carburetor. So emulsion tube, air correction jet, main jet, because that's what we're working on, the venturis, auxiliary venturi, all these different things. So your baseline. I note it down on paper, and then I'm going to take the car to the track. I'm going to drive it at high RPM range in my case, because that's where my power is. And I'm going to read the car. Now when I say I read the car, I'm going to listen to the car. I'm going to listen to the engine. I'm going to listen to the exhaust. Do I have backfires? I'm going to listen to the carburetor. Does it sputter? Do I have black puffs coming out of the exhaust? And of course, I can't see that, but maybe somebody else can. And unless you have a camera on it, then you could see it yourself. And I will feel if the car has power. You know, if I'm going on a straight line and I'm going to drive, let's say 4,000 or 5,000 RPMs in third or fourth gear, and the slightest increase on load on the engine, so maybe the road goes up slightly or something like that, or I get more headwind and I need to depress that pedal more and more, the throttle, I'm losing power, then I will record that. And then I do the same thing all over again, but now I'm going to drive at 3,500 RPM, so the mid-range RPMs. And I'm going to listen to the carburetor if it sputters. I'm going to listen to the exhaust if it has backfires. And again, I want to feel the car, I want to feel the power. And I record all this. Then I go back to the pit. And once I'm in the pit, I'm going to take my sheet where I have my carburetor layout, my carburetor specifications that I wrote down before. And I'm going to write down what I experienced on it. And then based on that, I will make my analysis, which I will explain to you shortly. And then I'm going to do the needed changes on the emulsion tube. Probably change the air correction jet, or maybe I change the main fuel jet on the emulsion tube. And in the worst case, I might even have to change the emulsion tube itself. And then I take the car back to the track. So guys, I have just done about half an hour on the track with the baseline on the carburetor, and that worked fairly well. Next time, in about half an hour, I'm going to get back on the track. I didn't go all the way because it's pretty wet today and pretty slippery and a lot of cars on the road, so it's always a bit watching out. And I'll do exactly the same thing, and I see if I have an improvement or not. And when I come back, I write it back down again, what we experienced, with what kind of jetting. And you keep doing this. So you might have to do this 4 or 5 times until you have things absolutely right. But keep that record on paper, because otherwise you're going to forget about it. You're going to lose that information. It's going to be chaos. Now, I said before that all this is trial and error. And that is so true. But there is logic to it. There is a procedure or a process to it. And this is what I'm trying to explain here. So enough of that. So now let's talk about a few examples of what can happen and what the issue is and how you can correct them. So we've done 2 laps to warm up the car, and we noticed that if we were going into the high RPMs on the straight stretch, that we had backfires and that we had kind of lack of power. And when we drove the same stretch on the mid RPM range, we had no backfires. But still, the power wasn't all what it was supposed to be. So with that information, we go back to the pit. We write it down on our piece of paper, and that is typically an indication that the mixture is too rich. So in this case, we go into increase the opening on the air correction jet. I think I've done the baseline right. So of course, I haven't gone all the way in the high RPMs. That's going to be for the next round we're going to take, because it was a bit wet, so now it's drying up. So hopefully things will be a lot better. So I'll see you back on the track. So we're about ready for the next ride, and I have put a jet in it on the air correction side, which is a little bit bigger. So I'm going to run a little bit leaner today. If you had backfires both on the high RPM and the mid RPM range, then you're not going to change the air correction jet on the emulsion tube, but then we're going to reduce the main fuel jet on the emulsion tube because the mixture is too rich. So once we've done that adjustment, we write it all down, we put the new jets up, and we get the car back on the track, and you repeat the same thing until things are correct. Now imagine that you were driving on that track in high RPM and you had no backfires, but the carburetor started to sputter. But on the mid-range RPMs, the carburetor did not sputter. So now we take the car back into the pit, and that is typically an indication of running too lean. And therefore, we go into adjust only the air correction jet, because we only had the problem in high RPMs. So the air correction jet now needs to become smaller. When I say smaller, the opening on it needs to be reduced with the next step. And I recommend only to step up or down with a single step. Now imagine that during that test that you had sputtering in the carburetor both on mid and high RPM range, but also not enough of power. That is an indication that the fuel mixture is too lean. And again, in this case, we are not changing the air correction jet, but we are changing the main fuel jet, and we're going to make it a bit bigger, so a larger opening to enrich the mixture. So this is what you do. So if you have the problem, no matter too rich or too lean, it doesn't matter, on both high and mid RPMs, you always modify your main fuel jet on the emulsion tube. If you only have it in the high RPMs, then you typically change it on the air correction jet. This is the kind of approach that you take, and this has always worked. However, I have to give you one warning. There could be some masquerading issues that make you believe that the air-fuel mixture is too rich, where in essence it is maybe correct. And that is the burn rate of the fuel that can cause issues and backfires to occur if your ignition is not set right. What I have here on the board is a burn rate of a specific air-fuel ratio for a specific fuel. So if we are having 14.7 parts of air and 1 part of fuel, we call also this the stoichio, of a specific fuel, then we will have a very specific burn rate of that fuel. So if we go into ignite that mixture, then it's going to take a bit of time before it really catches up, and then we have the peak of that explosion or the burning a little bit later, and you can see that right here. So we have a time t at which moment in time we're getting the maximum power out of that explosion or that combustion. And then slowly it's going to die out. So it is important that this peak right here is happening just after top dead center, because then we have the maximum power. If this peak is happening too late while the piston is already going down, then yeah, we're losing some of that power. And if this peak is coming too early, before the piston has hit top dead center, then we really have an issue, because then the engine will start to ping, and this is really no good, because we're trying to push back that piston, which is actually coming upwards. So we should avoid this by all means. Now we are controlling this moment by setting the advance on the ignition. So we go into ignite the fuel in advance, before the piston is at top dead center. So if you're running at 600 RPMs, and this is just an example, and call this idle, then this piston is moving 10 times a second up and down in that cylinder. And it has a certain speed, a certain distance it travels. or a certain amount of degrees on the crankshaft. So typically we would give it about 10 degrees, 12 degrees, 14 degrees, maybe 8 degrees advance. That depends on your engine. So we're going to ignite right here this fuel mixture at the compression stroke 10 degrees before the piston hits top dead center. And by the time the piston has hit top dead center, that fuel will have burned time t, and we're getting the peak of that explosion or the combustion just after top dead center. And that's perfect. Now, if we think about the fact that we're going to drive the car now at 6,000 RPMs, it's a different story now, because the piston is now moving 10 times faster. It's moving 100 times per second up and down in that cylinder. So it travels a lot of distance, a lot of degrees on the crankshaft. So if I was still to ignite it with 10 degrees advance, then I would have an issue, because that burning pulse here would come way after my top dead center. So I'm going to lose power. In fact, it could be that late that I'm going to have backfires, even though my mixture might be right, but I might have backfires, because on the race camshaft we start to open up that exhaust valve around 40 to 60 degrees and maybe even more before bottom dead center. So that piston is coming down on its labor stroke, and even when it's just past halfway, we already open up the exhaust valve. Now, if this pulse was coming late, then obviously we're going to push out a lot of unburned fuel into the exhaust, and then you're going to get backfire. You lose power, you have backfire, and that's going to give you the impression that your mixture is too rich, as we just discussed when I was sitting in the car. So you got to watch out for that. Now, in order to have this pulse at the right time, at a high RPM, we have what we call an advance curve on our distributor. And that's so important that you check that. Now on my car, my advance at 4,000 RPMs is around 40 degrees. Now you want to get as much as advance as you can to bring that peak as close as possible just after top dead center. That's going to be the moment you're going to have the maximum performance. So be very careful when you think you have a mixture which is too rich, and in essence it may not be, because you had an ignition problem. So make sure that you do check the advance curve on your distributor. So let us recap in short on how the acceleration works on a Weber DCOE. So we have our float, we've got our needle valve where fuel is actually coming in. It's going to fill up the float chamber with fuel. And on the bottom of the float chamber you will typically find an acceleration pump valve. This is that valve right here. So fuel will be able to get in like this, but can't get back out because it's a valve. In some cases, you may find a bleed hole right here on top, and I'll explain that in a minute what that is. So fuel will come through the valve and it will fill up the fuel pump. Now in the fuel pump there is a plunger which will come down whenever we depress the gas throttle. There's a spring and a lever, all that stuff can be adjusted, and this plunger will then descend and it will push out the fuel through the acceleration jet, which has a certain size, and then it will come out inside the barrel and be sprayed into the engine. The bleed hole right here is going to take away a bit of that fuel whenever the plunger is depressed. So if you have a huge bleed hole, there's going to be less fuel being pushed out through the acceleration jet. And that is important. So here we have a couple of adjustments that we can do. We can first of all adjust the acceleration pump valve because they come with different openings. Some of them have a bleed hole, and then you can get different bleed holes. So now we can adjust how much fuel is going to get into the acceleration pump. And we can also determine how much fuel will leak back out whenever we depress the gas pedal when the plunger comes down. And we can also adjust the acceleration jet because that will determine how much fuel is going to come out of this opening in the barrel. For the acceleration to work properly, we need to have injection of fuel at the right moment, as soon as we depress that pedal. We need to have it for a sustainable time, and we need to have it for a certain volume. And all this we can regulate with the acceleration jet, we can regulate with the acceleration pump valve, with different bleed openings and different types of plungers and springs and levers on the top. So that is the kind of thing we're going to do in this video. Now, if you have baselined your carburetor, we probably don't have to change the plunger or anything like that, but we may have to change the acceleration jet and potentially the acceleration pump valve. So now we're taking the car back on the track and we're going to test the acceleration. There's a couple of symptoms that we can have with acceleration. The first one is that you depress that throttle and the car kind of drops that on you. It doesn't react and then it accelerates, very slow. That is typically an indication that your acceleration pump or your acceleration jet is too small, that you don't get enough fuel immediately to accelerate, because you need that fuel to create more power. It could also be that you depress that throttle and that the car starts to bog. And then shortly after that, it starts to accelerate properly. Now that is typically an indication that you're injecting too much fuel. So your acceleration jet may be a little bit too large. So then you have to reduce that. There's another possibility as well, that you depress the acceleration and the car really reacts properly, but halfway the acceleration, it kind of dies out on you, the acceleration. It doesn't accelerate anymore like it should be. And in that case, you're probably running out of sufficient fuel on the acceleration pump, because that might have a bleed hole, and that bleed hole might be too big. So whenever the plunger comes down, it's going to squeeze back too much fuel through the bleed hole, so you don't have enough fuel for a prolonged acceleration. So then you may have to reduce that bleed hole. So this is how you're going to test this. It's not very complicated, and it might take you a couple of runs. And again, you record down what you changed every time and what you experience. So that is how simple that is. There's not much more to it. Now, some people say, well, I will adjust my acceleration pump statically, and you can, of course, and you can measure how much cc it squirts into the barrel of the carburetor, but I like to do it on the track. I like to do it in live because it gives me a much better impression. Of course, during the Weber baselining, I have set all this up in advance to a good baseline, so it should work reasonable. I just got back from the track, and I had to change once my air correction jet. I made it a step larger because I had a little bit of backfire, but for the rest the car was just doing perfect. So I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye-bye.